Welcome to Ethics in the Computer Age, Lecture 1, Part 2. In this lecture, we're going to pick up in part where we left off in an earlier lecture, in Part 1. We're going to start with a more in-depth look at Charles Darwin, and from there we're going to Okay, let's go back. Let's focus more on what we're going to talk about today. Coming into the 19th century, you may remember in the last lecture we talked about Charles Darwin. The major influences that are personified in Darwin's work are Lamarck, Comte, and Jeremy Bentham. Interestingly, Spencer, who was already using primarily Comte and Lamarck before Darwin, becomes heavily influenced by Darwin, and the result is social Darwinism. Let's talk briefly about Lamarck and Comte, and then look at social Darwinism with Spencer. Lamarck's focus was, for lack of a better word, inheritance. These guys do not know about genetics. And Lamarck theorized that habits could be inherited. So if I were a fine, upstanding, moral person, and I married a fine, upstanding, moral woman, then my children would inherit the habit of being morally superior. So behavior over time became habit. My habits determined what my children would be like. Comte, Auguste Comte, argued that human society, as mirrored in human religion, goes through three stages: fetish, metaphysical, or abstract. And positivism. In the fetish stage, we move from animism, and I'll define these words for you momentarily, to naturism, to polytheism, in naturism, everything, rocks, pebbles, water, dirt, dogs, cats, chimps, everything has a kind of divine quality about it. Naturism is the same, except only living things. And in polytheism, there are many gods, but they are somehow transcendent. That is to say, they are outside or above the world. In the metaphysical stage, We don't need all those gods anymore. So we have only one. And in the end, we realize through science and technology that we don't need God at all. We inevitably worship ourselves. If you think about this, the whole of human evolution for Comte is a movement towards rationality and reason. And at the end, we come to see we are the high point of all of creation, not because we need God, but because we're human. All right, any questions about this?
Quick question.
Mm-hmm.
What would have Comte thought of like certain Eastern religions like Taoism that really don't have like a god?
Well, that's a good question. And what we would add would be pantheism here,
Oh yeah, okay.
panentheism here, and if you think about positivism, it is really atheism.
Mhm.
Okay.
Sounds good.
All right. Other questions so far? Andreas, is making sense?
Yeah, I wanted to Lamarck, you said believed in inheritance of habits.
Yep.
Was he wasn't he was probably not thinking about like the genetics of passing down certain things. Like we know that certain people can be predisposed to like anxiety or depression. He didn't think of it that way, right? He was just thinking in terms of like his personal actions.
Yeah, because they didn't know anything about genetics. They did not know anything about genetics.
I think it's cool that they didn't know that, but we ended up coming to that conclusion later on. So he's kind of close.
Yep. Well, part of what's interesting is that Gregor Mendel actually pioneered genetics, but we forgot all about him. He experimented with peas, and it's not until 1900 that his work is rediscovered. But what's particularly interesting, as you'll see momentarily, is despite the discovery of genetics, social Darwinism remained and still remains in place. So, for example, his name was Francis Galton, and he was Darwin's cousin. He is the father of modern eugenics. And at one point, for 600 years, he analyzed the life of every famous Englishman to try to figure out which habits made them successful. His work led to sterilization and birth control in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. So,
Oh, can I interrupt here for a second? I apologize.
sure, go
Um,
ahead.
So I have a question. So does that sort of tie into like there's a lot of like this sort of self-help industry and like, you know, 7 highly effective habits of or 7 habits of highly effective people and stuff like that. Does that tie into this? Like this
Yep.
or to this Galton guy? Because that
Yep.
sounds similar.
It does, but it also ties into the fact that in the early 1970s, let's try it differently. The nuclear family begins to break down in 1800. It reaches a fevered pitch in 1971. We now have 5 generations of children who were not raised, for all intents and purposes, by parents. They don't know who they are. And when you couple that, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, wait, just I should have missed that as I was writing. What caused them to not know who their parents were?
Because the parents were off working.
Oh, okay, I understand. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Daycare and divorce. And since we won't let anybody be anyone teach us morals, everybody grows up in a morally neutral environment, which is the equivalent of growing up with no morals. And since we don't have any unifying concept of common good or common identity, we all spend most of our lives staring at our navels, wondering who we are. Hence the self-help industry. Okay, so generally speaking, social Darwinism falls into 2 groups: the biological and the sociological. Biological social Darwinism argues that some people are physically, biologically, genetically superior. And famously, Sumner argued that if you were rich, you were biologically superior. Ross argued in 1910 that if white people, Northern European whites, don't start having more children, they will be committing race suicide, and they will find themselves enslaved to the inferior people of color and immigrants. Sumner, in one of his more blunt moments, said, "Shut off city water, shut down city sewers, take away health care, don't educate them, let the poor people die. Work them until they die. They have no value."
Real
And
quick.
people like,
Oh,
pardon?
I was just gonna say, is he saying that people who are rich are biologically superior because they were born into a rich family? Is that where the biological part comes from?
Yeah, because their ancestors must have been biologically better to become rich.
Interesting.
Well, as they say, smoke this idea for a while. Why do you think why do you think Donald Trump gave a tax break to the rich people? Because rich people are better suited to survive. Under Ronald Reagan, it was called trickle down economics. Make the rich richer and the whole world will profit. And that's why socialism is an obscenity. Because if you listen closely to what the Republican mentality says, when you feed a poor person, you are enabling them to have more children. And they are not suited to the survival of our society. You are enabling the weak to thrive, and that is counter to the laws of nature.
I have a thought. I have a question.
Yep.
So, with that being said, that this seems sort of lead into sort of very like reactionary conservative mindset. Wouldn't, I guess, like Reagan and people, they all opposed birth control, right? They were very much against birth control. So how do those two things tie in, right? How is it that they were trying to like regulate?
Okay. Back during, unfortunately, for reasons I don't understand, the bulk of my friends are extremely conservative.
Mm-hmm.
And over coffee one morning, about a week before the election, I looked at one of them and I said, let me be blunt with you. If you could pass a law that stopped Northern European white women from having abortions, you wouldn't give a rat's ass how many women of color did. Tell me I'm wrong. Are you going to answer me? That's what it's about. They don't want Northern European white women aborting their babies because of race suicide. I'll remind you that Margaret Sanger was an advocate of eugenics. Margaret Sanger did not want poor women or women of color to have babies. That's one of the reasons she founded Planned Parenthood. Our birth control policy in this country is racist. It's designed to keep poor women and women of color from having babies. That's simple.
But aren't the babies the labor that they kind of build on? Like those babies are gonna be future workers that are gonna contribute to I guess capitalism in general, right? So they
Well,
would want them, wouldn't they?
up to a point, and go back to what I just told you a few minutes ago. If MIT is right, in 2038, 80% of the population won't make enough money to survive. AI is a form of eugenics. We don't need poor people anymore. We're going to replace them all with intelligent systems. Think about the implications of that. In the mid 60s, when I was a kid, my mother's threat was that if I didn't do well in school, I'd become a ditch digger. And in movies from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, You see lines of countless men with shovels building roads. It would have taken several decades to build the beltway around Greensboro. Not anymore. At one point, AT&T had over 150,000 operators. At one point, there were more than 19,000 elevator operators. Go ahead, raise the minimum wage. Watch what happens in Wendy's. We're headed for a world in which there'll be only one class of people. And that, in part, is a function of the Darwinian triple helix. Number one, humans competing against all other life forms. Two, racial competition. The word race is a 19th century invention to talk about the competition for survival. And the third form of Darwinian competition is within a given society. One of the driving intellectual forces behind this was Thomas Malthus. Thomas Malthus said, the reality of the matter is that land is limited. There is a relationship between population and food, such that population increases geometrically, but food supply can only increase arithmetically, which means that population will always outstrip available food. Malthus went on to say that at some point, even the most successful society is going to have to face the decision of who eats and who dies. And even though Malthus has been proven wrong, what do you think is happening in our society? Why do we not want poor people to have national health care? Why do we not want to invest equally in inner city schools that are predominantly people of color? Why is the educational system falling apart? Why do we not have social justice? And the answer is because we're still operating in a world that assumes that Thomas Malthus was right. We're still operating in a world that assumes that social Darwinism is right. If we feed someone who's poor, we're taking food away from the people who deserve to eat. Because if our society becomes weak, then we will not compete and we will be destroyed. Survival of the fittest.
And correct me wrong, is he the guy? I've heard about him being in connection to the Irish potato famine. Like he was kind of the engineer of that.
Accidentally and indirectly, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay, before I go on and try to bring things together for tonight, questions, thoughts?
None here.
Go ahead. Sorry, Ahmed.
No, I was just saying I'm all good here.
Okay. Do you see how this pertains directly to the world in which we live?
Shockingly, yes.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so going back to basically what you're saying is that eventually the rich are not going to need poor people to like do service-based stuff for them, right? Because they're going to have robots.
Yep.
But who's going to build the robots? Are we just going to build robots that are eventually just going to build other robots so that they don't need the people who build robots?
Yep.
Wow. But then what if the robots malfunction?
They'll fix themselves.
Oh, that's true. Wow.
The progress in the last 5 years has been shocking. For example, if you watch the Beltway being made, a fully automated machine did not have a problem making a straight line, a curve that was straight, but it could not make a curved curb. Now it can. So the humans who were necessary to make that section of a curb that had to curve are now gone.
I have another question.
Yep.
What about some more revolutions? Do you think that would halt anything?
I think the future of our species is hanging in the balance. And I'm not sure that we're deeply aware enough of the problem to fix it. For example, you would think that after the Russians failed in Afghanistan, we would know better. But we don't, because we don't understand. Our view of the world is completely skewed.
Let's say. Oh,
Sorry, go ahead. Ahmed?
Let's say we completely strip society of technology.
Mhm.
Would that benefit? Would that let's say benefit a step, or at least, yeah, would that benefit in taking a step in the right direction, or
Well,
would that be pointless?
I think the problem, let's try it this way. The case is currently being made that doctors who currently read mammograms need to not do that anymore, because AI is consistently 95% accurate. And we can't trust a doctor, because if the doctor has had an issue at home, or if the doctor is tired, or if the doctor is not paying attention, the best the doctor is going to do is 75%. So what do you think is going to happen? Pretty soon, no doctors will be reading mammograms. An AI-based system was built in New York City because the argument was that it would be far more fair when it came to things like parole and bail than any human would be. And then when they analyzed the system, they found out it was just as racist as a human.
Because it was created by a human.
Well, the data that it got was racist. So it made racist decisions. See, part of what Darwin missed is that basically what's happened is that as we have moved from the family to the nation state, the pace of technology has accelerated. The pace of science has accelerated. But what Darwin missed was that at the same time, the sphere of what is uniquely human has significantly decreased. We have demythologized. To demythologize is to take the myth out of ourselves. And the result of that is we are all a commodity, unless you're rich. We're all a commodity. And there is no moral or ethical check in place to stop that from happening. Profit for the sake of profit, knowledge for the sake of knowledge. Until we begin to think about social responsibility, until we have a sense of the common good, until we begin to recognize the fact that we're all human, the problem is going to get profoundly worse. Am I making sense?
Yes.
Could I ask for a point, like the way I'm conceiving this is that what you're telling us is that instead of thinking about necessarily a political revolution or like returning back to a state without technology, what we need is sort of a moral revolution, like a return. Yeah.
Michael, you've heard this story before.
Yep.
The rest of you have not. When I was 7 years old, because of an alcoholic, abusive father, I was sent to work as a migrant worker. By the time I was 10 years old, I saw 7 children die. In my 7th summer, when I was 7, I was cutting lettuce in a driving rainstorm. I couldn't feel my hands, it was so cold. I slit the artery in my left hand open. I stood up, watching the blood pulse out of my hand. And to be quite honest with you, I would have been happy to die. I never expected I would walk off that farm alive. I never expected to be 18 years old. A woman who didn't speak any English came running and stuffed her kerchief into my hand and saved my life. 3 Mays ago now, I got an email on the weekend from a UNCG student who asked to have coffee with me. And I'm happy to do that. Getting to know my students and to be there for them to help make a difference in their lives is why I do this. So I showed up on Monday morning outside Coffeeology, and he looked up at me and he said, I found the email I sent you, but I don't remember writing it, but I'm glad you're here. He literally flipped out of the chair, smashed his face on the concrete, started to convulse and to bleed. I was able to pin him against the glass window until the paramedics came and took him away. I didn't think about me. I didn't even think about him. I thought about that woman who saved my life when I was 7 years old. I thought about my undergraduate mentor who, when I hadn't eaten in 5 days, gave me $5 to buy dinner. The world has changed for better or worse, not by technology, but by humans. Every day in every action we make a decision about whether we're going to change the world for better or worse. And I will tell you many times over the course of the semester, every revolution in the history of the world for better or worse began with one person who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. See the world again for the first time. Question everything except nothing. And never lose sight of the fact that you're human first. Any other questions before I end this and take attendance? Okay. It's truly been a pleasure. Don't go anywhere. I'm going to turn off recording. And then we'll take attendance